Hello, everyone. Welcome to the concluding session of the first season of the online colloquium, Pluralizing the Anthropocene, Re-envisioning the Future of the Planet in the 21st Century. My name is Gonçalo Santos. I'm a social cultural anthropologist based in the Research Center for Anthropology and Health and the Department of Life Sciences at the University of Coimbra. I'm also the director of the international research network Sci-Tech Asia. Pluralizing the Anthropocene is a project curated by myself and my colleague Ana Luisa Santos, an anthropologist specialized in paleopathology, who is also working in the Research Center for Anthropology and Health in the Department of Life Sciences at the University of Coimbra. I will be the moderator of today's session. It is my great pleasure to host distinguished social anthropologist Michael Herzfeld. Hi, Michael. Welcome to Pluralizing the Anthropocene.
Hi, hello everyone.
Before moving on to a proper introduction of Michael's distinguished career, I would like to say a few words about the background of this colloquium, especially for those of you who are joining us for the first time. Pluralizing the Anthropocene builds on a creative partnership between several institutions representing the sciences, the arts, and the humanities. The Research Center for Anthropology and Health, the Fundação de Serralves, the Research Network Sci-Tech Asia, the Center for Functional Ecology, Science for People and the Planet, and the Department of Life Sciences of the University of Coimbra. We would like to thank these institutions for their encouragement and for making this colloquium possible. Many thanks also to the members of the Serralves technical team for their support. Serralves is a leading global cultural institution that brings together a contemporary art museum with a park and a villa. Serralves is also known for its role in promoting international public debates on topics that matter to everyone. And this colloquium is a wonderful example of this mission. Public response to the first season of this colloquium has been overwhelming. We would like to thank everyone for their continuing support. When Ana Luisa and myself started designing this colloquium last year, our goal was to create an open, multivocal, and international forum of debate on important issues that are not getting as much attention as they should. The world's attention at the moment is almost exclusively focused on tackling a global pandemic that has proved far more deadly than initially predicted. But one should bear in mind that the COVID-19 pandemic, as renowned Brazilian indigenous activist and leader Ailton Krenak has recently noted, is only a byproduct of planet-wide environmental uncertainties that are largely generated by human activities. Perhaps more than ever before, we need to stop for a moment and think more seriously about how to handle these increasing anthropogenic environmental uncertainties. The world we live in is very different from that of our grandparents and great-grandparents. It's warmer, drier, more polluted, and if the trend of ruination continues, it is more than likely that we'll compromise the livability of the planet for the future generations. The current production and consumption system has brought many benefits to a large number of people, even if with significant inequalities, but it has also led to unprecedented levels of environmental destruction and to a conjuncture of global warming and climate change with increasingly visible effects. The present decade, the third of the 21st century, will be decisive when it comes to addressing these issues and planning a little bit better the future of our communities before we plunge into a conjuncture of chaos, confusion, and rising inequalities, even more disturbing than what we are already witnessing under the current COVID-19 pandemic. There are, of course, many people who are denying the relevance of many of these concerns, but even these people cannot really ignore ongoing debates on environmental destruction, climate change, and the future of the planet. These are the biggest challenge of the epoch we live in, the Anthropocene, or the age of humans. The term Anthropocene was coined by the late atmospheric scientist Paul Crutzen in a conference sometime in 2000 to highlight the role of human activities in climate change. The term was then appropriated by geologists to refer to the present geological era as a period in which humans have become one of the most potent geophysical forces in the planet, and their activities leading to increasing environmental uncertainties. We are now in 2021, and Paul Crutzen died earlier this year, and there is still no consensus within the geophysical sciences on the validity of the term Anthropocene, just as there is no consensus on the precise beginning of the Anthropocene as a geological era. But most scholars would agree that the environmental impact of the human planetary expansion has become increasingly visible after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and in particular after World War II and the Great Global Acceleration. In the last 2 decades, the term Anthropocene has gained increasing popularity beyond the geophysical sciences, entering the humanities, the social sciences, the arts, and the media, and leading to the development of critical alternative terms like Capitalocene and many other, all of which defined in relation to the original concept of the Anthropocene. Whichever way we look at the concept, the Anthropocene has entered global cultural and political imaginaries as some kind of hyper-object or magnet that helps capture the tensions and the dilemmas of the age we live in. An age that is marked by increasing anxieties about the future of human life on the planet. But the Anthropocene is not just a runaway world of environmental doom, it is also about overcoming disaster and catastrophe and creating new visions of hope and justice. The realities of environmental pollution, anthropogenic climate change, species extinction, and sea level rise compel a reimagining of humanity's place in the world and an urgent rethinking of the dominant forces threatening the ecological balance of the planet. A rethinking that must go beyond make-do patchwork interventions like green capitalism. Using the term Anthropocene to refer to the current age of increasing environmental uncertainties has started new conversations about what needs to be changed in the global economic system, but it has also generated a monolithic understanding of the Anthropocene as a unified human experience. The framing of the Anthropocene around a universalizing species paradigm has a homogenizing effect that hides significant exclusions and inequalities. Not all humans are equally implicated in the major forces driving contemporary human environmental crises, and not all humans, and hardly any non-humans, are invited into the conceptual spaces where these disasters are theorized or responses to disaster formulated. If we really want to do something to change the current global economic system, we need to be capable of developing a more inclusive conversation. And we need to be capable of building a global economy that is no longer focused on conquering nature, but on learning how to coexist with the plurality of life forms around us. This online colloquium features well-known scholars committed to developing a more inclusive and diverse understanding of Anthropocene debates of resilience, adaptation, and the struggle for environmental justice. Every talk will be followed by an informal conversation and a Q&A session with the audience via the chat function. The chat function is currently closed, but it will be open towards the end of the talk. If you would like to ask a question, please prepare your question and have it ready to be posted in the chat box once the Q&A session starts. This talk will be conducted in English. If you need language assistance, Microsoft Teams has a live transcript function that can be activated by pressing the live transcript symbol that is located in the right bottom corner of the application. A number of languages are available via this functionality. Please bear in mind that this event is being recorded by Serraus and will be later released for public viewing via social media and the internet. Let me go back to the main reason why we are all here today. Michael Herzfeld. Michael Herzfeld is the Ernest E. Monrad Research Professor of the Social Sciences in the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University, and is former and founding director of the Thai Studies Program, Asia Center, also at Harvard University. He is senior advisor on critical heritage studies to the International Institute for Asian Studies, Leiden, and visiting professor at Leiden University, amongst many other visiting positions in major universities in China and Australia, for example. His research interests cover social theory, history of anthropology, social poetics, knowledge politics, politics of history and heritage, crypto-colonialism, artisanship, and the practice of comparison, and is ethnographically focused on Europe and Southeast Asia. He is the author of 11 books, including Siege of Spirits, Community and Polity in Bangkok, 2016, and well-known Cultural Intimacy, Social Poetics and the Real Life of States, Institutions, and Societies. He's currently working on a new book based on his Lewis Henry Morgan lectures of 2018, and provisionally entitled Subversive Archaism, Troubling Traditionalists and the Politics of National Heritage. He is a past winner of the J.I. Stanley Prize and the J.B. Doan Prize in the Anthropology of Art and the Rivers Memorial Medal. In our first session of Pluralizing the Anthropocene, we had anthropologist Tim Ingold arguing that the global economic system must be rebuilt around a more encompassing and inclusive notion of sustainability, the sustainability of everything and everyone. In our second session, anthropologist Anat Singh called for a more pluralistic understanding of the Anthropocene and showed the need to rewrite the history of modern environmental destruction from a more than human perspective. In our third session, anthropologist Agustin Fuentes took this more than human perspective to another level by bringing into focus the ecologies of despair and hope, shaping the relations between humans and other animals in the Anthropocene. In our fourth session, biologist Helena Freitas talked about the need to respect nature and the challenges of developing international polycentric frameworks of governance, or better still, of environmental governance. In our fifth session, social scientists Ife Lee and Judith Shapiro invited us to look at the challenges of the Anthropocene from a different geopolitical perspective, that of China and its new forms of state-led environmentalism. Today, anthropologist Michael Herzfeld will revisit the notion of planetary security, urging us to adopt a critical stance toward the very idea of the Anthropocene and how its significance might be twisted to serve only the wealthy and the powerful. Michael, I'm truly delighted to have you here with us. Thank you so much for joining the Pluralizing the Anthropocene stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Herzfeld, Security in the Age of Inhumanity. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gonçalo. It's a great honor and pleasure to be in this series. Also a great responsibility in being the last one of this year's round of talks. I want to thank you personally, an old friend, but also the Serral's Foundation for their generosity in setting up this occasion. Such moves give us hope for the future. They open up discourses and contexts that frankly have not been taken very seriously, or perhaps have been taken so seriously by those who wield global power that they have seen fit to suppress them. I am not, I promise you, a conspiracy theorist, but on the other hand, I think it's very important to understand that one of the most frightening things that we can do from the perspective of those who do have a great deal of power in the world and are very wealthy is to talk about the details of the existence of the underprivileged. And so in a way, that's going to be what I'm going to talk about today. The issue at stake really has to do with a rapidly accelerating process whereby indignity has been created among the disadvantaged. Those who have power are able to exercise freedom without responsibility, and they are apparently free to visit upon others responsibility for their own lack of success, freedom, and all the other things that make life dignified. This is the process that some writers now call responsibilization. These, again, these wielders of what we now call neoliberal power, and neoliberalism is a concept that I think should be very tightly investigated in conjunction with talking about the Anthropocene, insist that we have choices. But the problem with their notion of choice is that it doesn't ask the more important question, what kind of choice are we allowed? Is it really an open choice, or are we restricted by what they seek or see fit to allow us to consider? What I want to warn against is a phenomenon that I would like to call methodological neoliberalism. And what I mean by that is we have to be very careful not to think like neoliberals. Even if we individually, and some of us may well do this, endorse the ideology of neoliberalism, the danger that it poses is that it has become a kind of common sense in which notions like choice and freedom seem to have fixed meanings, to be fixed values. Certainly choice is not, because those who do not have much wealth or political liberty do not have very real choices. And it seems to me that very often their choice is one of between different ways of dying. Freedom, again, I think is a very relative term. And since this is the focus of my talk today, we also have to ask, what kind of security is being involved here? Are we talking about the security of a gated community? Are we talking about the security from other kinds of enclaved communities, such as ghettos? Are we talking about the security of borders? And why should borders be secure? Who are they secure for? What are the political costs of saying, what about open borders? This has become a very topical matter, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, when, of course, COVID pandemic has threatened many of the comfortable arrangements reached within the Schengen area, especially, and has posed a real challenge also to the cultural assumptions underlying Schengen, that there is such a thing as a European culture, and that all of these people coming from outside are threatening it. Therefore, security involves keeping them out. First of all, as a number of anthropologists have shown, they can't be kept out, and most anthropologists would agree that they shouldn't be kept out, that the whole notion of a singular, immutable European cultural base is itself part of an ideological myth that in the Anthropocene is now expanded to universalize a kind of common sense. What we are seeing is evacuation of the spaces of social life by various forces, mostly economic and political ones, at the expense of those who have the weakest means of resistance. Eviction is certainly one of those. It's one of the most important. Ethnic cleansing, of course, is one of the most brutal. And on the model of ethnic cleansing, I've coined the term spatial cleansing to talk about a process whereby different classes are enclaved within the planning parameters of city planning. Arjuna Padurai calls the same phenomenon urban cleansing. They're pretty much the same phenomenon. The notion of urban renewal, which is often just a polite euphemism for gentrification, usually involves removing populations those with authority do not wish to give access to the center to. This produces ghettos. It produces various kinds of enclaves, including enclaves of the relatively newly wealthy people who, as for example in Sao Paulo in Brazil, as Teresa Caldeira has pointed out, end up actually feeling very insecure because they are identifiably marked now as living within an enclave that is rapidly descending from comparative comfort to a lack of resources. And such processes then produce more and more homeless people, and those homeless people join the many categories that, again, those with power have chosen to regard as dangerous population, a term that goes back to France in the early 18th century, certainly in the 19th century, and it continues to be used implicitly, explicitly today. I should have said 19th century, that's really when that term came into general use. Now, there are many organizations worldwide that are trying to work for improvement in the situation. I personally have been much interested in the efforts to try to push back against massive evictions. COVID-19 has brought the eviction question into especially sharp relief because obviously with COVID, eviction would not only create many more homeless people, it would also, by putting people on the streets, increase the dangers of the pandemic. And associations like this one, it had it's having its summit right now in Porto, but it's I think mostly or largely Italian-based, originated organization. I'm not absolutely sure I know the Italian operators of this, and because I'm going to show you some material from my own fieldwork in Rome later in the talk, I do want to signal that they have played an important role, in my view, in pushing back against eviction. But their efforts have not stemmed the larger part of the tide of evictions. The creation of gated communities, this is from St. Louis, Missouri in the United States, and notice the rather rudely abrupt way in which access is denied to all of those who are not privileged and wealthy enough to belong to this community. Such enclavization of a gentrifying kind, unfortunately, is cropping up in many, many parts of the world. And those who drive it, mostly neoliberal managers, argue that they are improving the neighborhood, that somehow they're getting rid of the riffraff, and they're treating people as human garbage. This, on a very large scale, creates a kind of environmental problem that the more orthodox environmentalists don't consider environmental, but consider the problems of a large number of people living on the streets, undermining their hygiene, undermining their safety in various ways, and above all, themselves being subjected to a deprivation of one of those things that gives people dignity, namely a roof over their heads. Bangkok, where I have conducted some research I'm going to show you, a very complex city that embodies in many ways all of the threats that we now experience to the world environment. Huge buildings generating enormous amounts of greenhouse gases, traffic polluted and polluting, drug problems leading also to enormous amounts of pollution in the streets. And nevertheless, at the same time, at somewhat below street level, if you will, at the level of the canals, the possibility of a very different way of life. Now, in the 1950s, Bangkok was regarded as the Venice of the East, and it was riddled with canals which provided, as this one still does, some of the major forms of transportation. There were then very few cars, relatively speaking. In the 1950s, a governor of Bangkok decided to modernize the city and filled in most of the canals and built a road network. The result of this was that the temperature of the city went up by several degrees Celsius, the average temperature of the city. We now joke that Bangkok only has 3 seasons, hot, hotter, and hottest, but the reality is that the city is infernally hot, and that this is also creating all sorts of other dangers, including the proliferation of various kinds of rodents and other diseases. Now the current Bangkok authorities want to raise the temperature even more. They have been persuaded to halt this effort, but I'll talk about it again a bit later. They want to create river boardwalks along the river, the Chao Phraya, which is the central artery of the city, in order to allow tourists to come and view the admittedly very beautiful riverside sites, temples, mosques, churches, and traditional communities. In the process, they're also removing many of the traditional communities. So they are not only raising the temperature of the city or threatening to, again, maybe by another 2 or 3 degrees centigrade, they are also destroying the human life without providing adequate alternatives, places where these evicted people will go. This is a typical traffic scene in Bangkok, one of the major centers. Garbage is produced everywhere, and the people who have to deal with it are treated as human garbage. Many of them are members of minority groups, or they are Thais from the northeast who are considered by most Bangkokians to be more Lao than Thai, and speak a dialect that is closer to Lao than it is to standard Central Thai. But even the haunts of the wealthy are not completely immune from this mad rush to build and rebuild and recreate. The Dusit Hotel, a famous Art Deco style hotel, you see 2 views of it here, was recently destroyed. And most importantly of all, huge numbers of riverside communities, about 200 communities, have been destroyed already to make way for this boardwalk that, if environmental wisdom prevails, may yet not be built. But what to do about the people who've been evicted? This is not a problem to which there is an easy answer. The community of Pemahakan, where I did my research, was a very small community of 300 people. And in my new book that Gonçalo was kind enough to mention, the title is now indeed the one you announced. It will be out in November. My informants, who were about 300 in number, the inhabitants of this little community, were facing eviction, mass eviction, and countered it by invoking the idea that they were better guardians of Thai national traditions than the bureaucrats who were seeking to evict them. That argument actually managed to stave off disaster for a quarter of a century. It's a major story and an ennobling story of resistance to authoritarian governance, but it didn't save the community in the long run. They were watched over by the spirits of the community, notably, of course, these more human figures, the smaller ones at the front of the shrine and in the lower part of the picture. These are the spirits of the, supposedly, of the place. They have a very vague relationship to past inhabitants of the place. But notice that behind the man in the lower picture, there is a small statuette of King Rama V, the great modernizer, who started this rush to a thoughtless modernity that today is threatening Thailand with all sorts of environmental and human disasters. He was, I would argue, forced into this kind of process by, indeed, what I call crypto-colonialism, which Gonçalo also mentioned. And to give you a sense of what a peaceful place this community is, a cat who may indeed have been the incarnation of the spirit of some previous resident, because Thais believe in reincarnation, felt totally at ease even when I started taking photographs on this shrine to the spirits of the place. Pemahakan represents an attempt by these 300 people to maintain the dignity of having their own roof over their own heads, but also they offered a compromise solution whereby they would admit that they were not the owners of the place, but they would be permitted to remain on site in houses that they had either rebuilt or restored themselves, and with responsibilities for the historical monuments on the site, thereby relieving the authorities of a great deal of administrative and bureaucratic nuisance. In the end, and especially after the two military coups of 2006 and 2014, resistance proved impossible, and just a couple of years ago, they were finally all evicted. And in an act of what I call cultural vandalism, the authorities not only destroyed some of the more ramshackle houses, but 7 houses that were generally recognized by the Association of Siamese Architects as fine examples of the vernacular architecture of the 19th century. To understand this, we have to realize that in the karmic system understood by modern Thais, a karmic system that looks remarkably like Weber's concept of Protestantism, those who are already wealthy are assumed to deserve their wealth. Those who are poor and marginal are assumed to deserve not only their poverty, but to be kicked out and treated generally with disrespect. And that's unfortunately what the very hierarchical society meted out from the top to the bottom, and not only to the people of Pemahakan, but more generally. It's really important, and that's something we anthropologists work with all the time, to understand this ideological, conceptual, and spiritual context in order to know precisely why it was even possible for such an act of vandalism, social and cultural, to take place. Here we see the attempts by the people themselves, with money they raised internally, to restore some of the more ramshackle houses. So top left, a house as it had been, bottom left as it was restored, and now on the right hand side of the slide you can actually see the restored version facing two of the older houses that were deemed to be in good enough condition that they could just be restored without being replaced with a new structure, as happened with the ramshackle one. And you see it here in the replacement with a real attempt by an architect brought in by the community and with money raised by the community to reproduce the traditional form of the housing. The place was planted with all sorts of flora, and responsibility for the cleanliness was assumed by the residents themselves. The sign actually says that you are asked to respect, preserve the cleanliness of the place. They tried to redesign the whole community. One governor of Bangkok gave serious consideration to this plan, but he was then ousted, and this was what eventually happened. This is a tragedy in many, many registers. This was once a living, vibrant community. The 300 people have now been scattered around Bangkok. Most of them are desperately poor because they were mostly food vendors, and they were actually reliant on long-established ties with customers who work in bureaucratic offices in this area, which is right in the heart of old Bangkok. Not only were the bureaucrats moved out to more peripheral offices, much to their own annoyance because it became inconvenient and created more of a traffic flow rather than less, but look at the damage that is done to this community. And what replaced it was what I call bureaucratic nostalgia, signs that recall a previous community. Now, I'd seen signs like this all over Bangkok, and I had not realized until I saw it happening right here that, in fact, this is how the authorities claim to be the guardians of tradition. They say, look, we are paying respect to what used to be here, but completely airbrushing out of the picture any trace of the fact that they were the ones who actually destroyed that community. And what they replaced it with was what I call a postmodern potty. Toilets, which at the time that I took this photograph were not even functioning, in the middle of a public park that has nothing else in it at all. Move to Rome. Now, when I did my fieldwork in Rome in 1999-2000, in the second half of that fieldwork and the 6 months followed, it is estimated that 16,000 new homeless people were added to the Rome population. They were not migrants coming into Rome. They were people who had lived, their families had lived in the center of Rome for at least 2 centuries in many cases, and were now made homeless because with a neoliberal mayor installed, even under a left-wing political party's official imprimatur, and with collaboration, collusion from the Vatican and other forces, including a number of private enterprises, there was a general agreement that the way to make the best out of the center of Rome was to push these poor people out, gentrify, and make it essentially a dormitory community for the rich and important. The church was very much implicated in this. As many of you know, the Catholic Church operates on a principle of subsidiarity, so the Vatican disclaimed all responsibility. Individual churches and individual confraternities, nonetheless, did not hesitate to evict the old, the weak, the infirm. Meanwhile, the churches were making money, and as you can see, they were lending their facades to Mammon for advertising. But the evictees were not likely to give up, and they actually managed, in this case, to break into the church and get up to the top where they unfurled banners saying, "Homeless, senza casa." This is from a scene, a tragic scene that I witnessed, a group of 10 families evicted from a house in Via degli Erminesi, right in the heart of old Rome. The sign says no to deportation, because that's how they experienced it. The left wing, because it was now implicated in the politics of the neoliberal governance of Rome, claimed that these people who were being evicted were not really real working class people. They were lower bourgeois, and anyway, they were beginning to vote for the right. The reason they were beginning to vote for right-wing parties, whose youth group are actually putting up these barricades, was because the left was holding its nose and refusing to have anything to do with it. So ideological labels turned out to be quite misleading. In the place of this community of 10 families, a private company, which had managed after a series of sales to take control of the building, carried out some so-called refurbishments. This is all from the same street, and this is what the homes looked like, at least on the website. It's now disappeared, but this gives you a sense of what these houses became. Luxury apartments broken up into very small rooms for wealthy people, many of whom didn't have the slightest intention of living in the city. Meanwhile, of course, all over the city, we were seeing groups of people moving out. And if you think that in a modern democracy, violence by the police doesn't happen, most of you, I'm sure, know much better than that. In the case of this area where I was working, there was very little direct violence by the police or anyone else because, after all, this is a prime tourist area, and the banks and various companies who were involved did not want to see such damage inflicted in ways that would drive away tourism. I think some of the same logic applied to the rather gentle way in which the people of Pomahakan were also evicted. I say gentle, but they were nonetheless subject to a kind of, if it didn't involve hitting them and beating them, still involved depriving them of essential parts of their lives. That is structural violence of a particularly odious kind, and all eviction, it seems to me, and especially in a difficult time like the one we're experiencing now, is structural violence. If you look at headlines from the time I was working in Rome right up to the present, you see many statements like this. So with COVID-19, for example, in Rome, what do we do as the shelters shrink because nobody is able to staff the shelters because movement around the city is restricted during the lockdown? That pushes more and more people out onto the streets where they have nowhere to go. And of course, Rome, at least being in southern Europe, isn't quite so unkind. But here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the winter, people are forced to sleep in the snow because there's nowhere for them to go. Now, Boston, the Boston area, does have some sorts of shelters, and I think a real attempt is being made by our local city administrations to deal with the situation. But if they had maintained rent control so that fewer people would have been rendered homeless, there would have been a much smaller problem. Some countries that never thought they would have homelessness, Japan is a particularly interesting case, are now facing a virtual epidemic of homelessness. And even a small town like Melbourne, Florida, notes, all right, you might say that to go up by 30 homeless people isn't very much, but it's a 13% increase in terms of Melbourne's unsheltered homeless population. And if you apply that globally, and we are talking about a global phenomenon now, especially given the global pretensions of neoliberal capitalism, the impact is going to be shattering, both in terms of the environmental damage and in terms of the creation of an increasingly desperate underclass that will indeed eventually rise up in anger and threaten the security of those who are living in gated communities. It is hard to imagine a situation in which that sort of revolutionary response would not happen unless and until we can intervene. And to do that, I would argue, we need anthropologists. Now, you may say this is special pleading for our discipline. Yes, it is special pleading because we are in a very special place to do something. That place has to do with the way we do our research. We don't use big surveys, and we really don't use interviews very much. When we do, they're more like conversations rather than questionnaires. What we do instead is we look at the very small details of everyday interaction to try to understand why, for example, small communities despised by the authorities and perhaps hunted from their place of residence by, again, of the authorities or by the pressures of big capital, how it is that they have survived. One of the most damaging terms that we see all the time in these kinds of questions is the distinction between formal and informal settlements. Now, who says what is a formal settlement or an informal settlement? Those who have power. Those who say these settlements were not authorized by the city plan. But if you look at the city plan of Rome, very little of what was actually built in the last 500 years was authorized by anyone. Even, as one architect pointed out to me, the famous balcony on the palace of Josephine Bonaparte in the Piazza Venezia was actually built in violation of the then existing rules. So the point here is not to talk about migrants and illegal migrants, but as Nicholas de Genova has pointed out, illegalized migrants, not to talk about marginal people, but to talk about marginalized people. Let us not only investigate the agency of the marginal and the poor, which is something anthropologists have been doing well for a long time. Let us also point to the agency of the powerful who have the power to protect their agency from our inspection. I used to say that one definition of power was the capacity to keep anthropologists out. And I think that's actually not a bad definition. We anthropologists ask awkward questions, and governments and wealthy institutions, and especially corporations, tend not to like us very much. More open ones are willing to listen. And I appeal to all of you to give and to put pressure where pressure can be placed to have that voice heard more clearly. The idea of the Anthropocene is useful in that it expands our understanding of the scope of human damage to the environment. That, I think, has been very clear in all of the talks so far. But it also points to the fact that more and more human beings are subjected to inhuman conditions, hence the title of my talk. And it often justifies those conditions in the name of a supposedly universal aesthetic. The city should be beautiful, the countryside should be beautiful, but not looking at the local cultural terms, some of which are very localized in the sense that they are of communities rather than of a nation state, in which people define what is beautiful, what is acceptable, and what is dignified. This reproduces the logic of colonialism on a global scale in what I have elsewhere called the global hierarchy of value. And it's a hierarchy that is still heavily dominated by Western values, banishing many forms of diversity to the level of distant memory. The number of languages and dialects that disappear every day is astounding. It's horrifying. Now, you may say, wouldn't it be convenient if we could all do everything in English? Wait until I ask you to do that in your own language. Admittedly, for entirely financial reasons, because the universities are also being financialized, university administrators are asking that we teach our courses in English rather than forcing students to learn the local language. Recently, I had to give a course in Italy in English, which I thought was also an insult to my own dignity, but especially to the dignity of the country, by an Italian university desperate to get the money that so-called international students would bring. My students not only had to do their fieldwork in the language of the country where they worked, they had to give lectures about their work and public talks in that language as well. So what is security in the Anthropocene? Is security the equality of opportunity, security of work and housing, having a predictable lifestyle, security on the streets, but then who's that security for? And which community are we talking about? Is it about security of borders? Well, you can answer that question by asking whether it's a question of security from state surveillance. Am I free to walk about without the state watching everything I do? Or is it the security provided by state surveillance, which might also be used invasively in my life and those of those around me? The existential danger posed by this situation, then, is that neoliberal capitalism provides a moralizing discourse to justify the accumulation of great wealth in a few hands, arguing that in the Anthropocene only a few are fit to lead the world. Does that remind you of something? Just think of 1984. Just think of Brave New World. Just think of what happened in Nazi Germany and many other totalitarian states, some of which are in operation, sadly, to this day. It also exploits this Eurocentric humanistic concept of a universal set of values, this global hierarchy of value. And I use the word value in the singular there to emphasize that this is something that is seen as a single thing that can't be argued with, a single rationality. The idea that rationality is itself culturally variable is very frightening to those who have power, because it threatens the logic on which their power is based. And this claim also proceeds to universalize selfish and particular interests. It ignores the contradictions embedded in its own rhetoric. It will, these neoliberal apologists will talk about human rights, the right to dignity, and even the right to a home, but they have essentially exploited and expropriated that terminology for purposes that have to be examined. It attempts to generalize the security of the few and the security of the many. So by securing the borders, they are in a way justifying then their increasingly present surveillance, not only of city spaces, but even of domestic spaces at home. And it intensifies inequalities. And that's the one thing that the COVID-19 pandemic has really brought into sharp relief between countries, but also between groups of people in a single country or a single city, because those who are wealthy have been able to get access to vaccination and other forms of protection much more efficiently, much more quickly than others. The United States has been very slow to share its stock of unused vaccines with other countries. Fortunately, now it is beginning to change its policy, and I believe that under the present administration, we can hope for more of that. But the real danger doesn't actually come just from the government. It comes from very large numbers of people who, for example, backed the previous administration and did so in the name of liberty. That is, these are what I call irresponsible libertarians. They say, I am free not to get vaccinated. I am free to walk around without wearing a mask. That's my right. And overlooking the idea that freedom is part of a social contract. This is crucially important. So is there a solution? Well, I would not be so bold as to offer a solution, in part because, as you've seen, I don't believe in overarching, holistic answers to problems. The solution has to have multiple forms. It has to be representative of the multiple forms of human experience. But this does mean a more equitable redistribution of resources. It does mean ecological balance, which my colleagues on the series have spoken about much more eloquently and in a much more informed way than I could, and respect for diversity, including that of languages as well as that of species and of ethnicities, and of classes for that matter. It means making resources available to, I would say, the vast majority of the world's population. Some people will never have that kind of access for reasons that we can only guess at, but we can work against that. No solution is perfect. Neoliberalism tries to present itself as having the perfect answer. You make your choices, you're free to make those choices, and your freedom is guaranteed. This is a big lie, if ever there was a big lie. to my thinking, the first order of business, and that is where my gratitude to the foundation is especially real and sincere at this point, is to provide better education. Yes, through seminar series like this one, through publications, and just through going out and talking and listening more carefully to what anthropologists are reporting from their very detailed studies, and not saying, oh, but those are just exceptions. The exceptions belie the generalizations generated by other social sciences, many of which are often complicit with power. They have to be. It's very difficult to do political science and to get the sympathy and support of elites if you don't, in turn, make your data available to those elites. Fine, but we also want to hear from those who have not had a voice. And this is not a matter of giving them a voice. They have that voice. It's a matter of making that voice audible and perhaps helping it to have some impact, because we as members of privileged classes, and we are, despite the increasing proletarianization, I would say, of the academic profession, are in a position still to argue for greater respect for what we have heard from our informants. It is not a coincidence that people like Donald Trump invade against expertise. The cultivation of fear of expertise is itself part of that big lie. And it's a big lie that we have to fight, and the solution must begin with that fight. It's a task in which social and cultural anthropology potentially have a leading role. I don't believe in necessarily something called applied anthropology, which might end up just being doing the work of a bank that wants to put various projects through and doesn't want to be bothered by rebellious local populations. But I do want anthropology to become more involved. I think we have long since left behind the idea that objectivity is our goal, because the subjective-objective distinction, so long taken as a piece of common sense, is itself part of that global hierarchy of value in a set of concepts resting heavily on the philosophy of Descartes. So it's time now to stand up and hear it from the margins, to ask why those margins are marginal, who declared them to be marginal, bring them to the center, and use their experience to build a better world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was very, very rich. And I think it was, in many ways, what was missing so far in this series, a critical take on the Anthropocene. I'm kind of tempted to push you a little bit further in that direction and ask you a question about the Anthropocene, or as you call it, the Anthropocene, right? Because as you point out, the very same age that has been witnessing increasing anthropogenic environmental uncertainties, it's also the very age in which we have been witnessing increasing signs of inhumanity in all its forms. I mean, you talked a little bit about some of the experiences of inhumanity as observed by anthropologists in urban contexts, but we might as well talk about experiences of inhumanity is experienced by peoples in the margins of the capitalist system. Ethnic minorities, smaller populations, smaller groups, marginal in many kind of ways. So kind of my question, is it possible to salvage at all this notion of planetary security, or to put it in a sort of a different way? Is it possible to work and operationalize the notion of planetary security outside the neoliberal model of exclusion and exploitation?
That's a very important question. Thank you, Gonçalo. I think the answer is that we have to be pragmatic, and anthropologists, after all, are empirical scholars. But we also have to realize that in order to achieve our goals, we have to demonstrate to those with power that what they are currently doing is not in their own long-term interests. For some reason, people who keep talking about making the world safer for their grandchildren and for their future students and so on, and for future generations, and they use this language very loosely and very willingly, don't actually seem to realize that the way they do this, the way they talk about it, is empty. That's why in making it the Anthropocene, I put in a BS, and you can, I mean, that was quite deliberate. It's obscene. And it's obscene because it's a self-indulgent appeal to the notion of generational continuity that actually only serves the comfort and wealth of the current generations. The disparities in wealth have increased exponentially over the last 30 or 40 years. Now, I have never really understood why anyone would want to have a salary of effectively of $1 million a year. I would be quite happy to deal with a great deal less, and I do. But that's not really the issue. The issue is that more and more the wealth of the world is being concentrated in a few hands. And the longer we let this process go on, the more difficult it will be to reverse it, and therefore the more dangerous the threat to the environment. So it does seem to me that we anthropologists and people who think the way we do and have respect for global diversity must, in fact, become politically more engaged, both in our writing and in other ways, and do everything we can to empower those groups that are pushing, for example, green parties, for example, more progressive trends within existing political parties, but also to remember that, for example, a socialist label does not guarantee socialism. And we know that very well from past experience, and there are plenty of examples in the world today. So I see the role of an engaged anthropology as increasingly articulating in ways that will be open to public inspection, an ongoing critique of current modes of governance. Most national governments these days are neoliberal, even if they claim to be something very different. And so it seems to me that that's where the conversation has to take place. That's where we can do the most. The other question I think that comes right out of the question you posed is then, once again, what do we actually mean by security and securitization? What are we trying to secure? It seems to me that the thing that is most worth securing is the dignity of every human being. And that dignity is being compromised by ideologies that say you should be content to be poor because, after all, your religion tells you that it's ennobling, or your leaders tell you that it's ennobling. We should contest all those kinds of ideologies. We should contest the idea that people's attachment to place and community is irrelevant in this global age. Who defines the criteria of relevance? We should be more active in journalism and perhaps break down the barrier between academia and journalism. There are lots of people who are doing this already, but it seems to me that those who are much more able than I to operate, for example, with social media, have opportunities to expand this discourse. And let us not forget, before you attempted to say that this is just about words, that words have a material existence. They have effects. If enough people can be persuaded that cultural diversity is something valuable for them, then we may begin to see some change. But I am not terribly optimistic, I have to say. And I think that the danger of the term Anthropocene is precisely that it will be taken over by the wrong people.
I mean, I appreciate your emphasis on the dignity of every human being. It kind of resonates a little bit with points that were made in previous sessions as well about the need to develop a framework that is concerned with everyone, not just a few, right? So this idea of inclusiveness. What is the place of non-humans in your framework? You know, is that part of the everyone that you are talking about, or we need differentiations here, Michael?
It has to be, but I'll just cite an old proverb: charity begins at home. We are not going to inculcate respect for the animal world, for example, and still less for the faunal world and the mineral world, unless we start by thinking and getting everyone to think more creatively about what we mean by respect for each other. Also, there are plenty of examples of people who showed respect for animals but didn't show respect for their fellow humans historically. Think of the number of Nazi leaders who were very affectionate pet owners, for example. Now, you could say that pet owning was actually itself a form of structural violence. We can have an interesting debate about that. I don't want to trivialize the question that you asked. I think it is a very important question. But at the same time, don't you think that we would be better off keeping that in mind, keeping in mind the fact that by respecting social diversity, we will also be bringing more people into the conversation about respecting other kinds of diversity. Whereas if we don't respect social diversity and cultural diversity, what we'll end up doing is imposing, once again, an exclusionary model, and not all fauna will be equally respected. And if they are respected, it will be for all the wrong reasons.
No, totally. I agree with you. I was also very compelled by your critique of neoliberal ideas of freedom. I think it's a major problem, just as the issue of how to bring about solidarity in this new framework of, you know, everybody's going for their own individual interest. It's all about individual choice. It's all about individual autonomy.
May I interrupt you for a second? Because I think you've just raised a point that's very close to my interests, and and that was mentioning solidarity. So Greece is a country that is often considered to be rather marginal in the European scheme of things, and has been treated that way by the larger European countries over and over. Indeed, I've argued that it's a case of crypto-colonialism, although nowadays I think Greece is beginning to stand much more on its own feet and doing very well at it in spite of all the problems. The reason I mention that is that one of the things that gives me hope in Greece is the emergence of more and more solidarity movements in a country where people used to say, and we anthropologists were feeding that stereotype, these people are always quarreling, they could never get together about anything. Well, the fact is that they now have a much more clearly defined external enemy in the form of the EU bureaucracy, in terms of certain, again, global interest. And you see suddenly not only movements of solidarity among groups of Greeks, but also solidarity with migrants, which is really interesting because there was initially a lot of resentment of the arrival of all these migrants. There still is in some quarters. There are still neo-Nazis in Greece, but it's really fascinating to see how the country has, and then, you know, looking back at my old field notes and realizing that actually even in the old days, they would talk about mutual assistance as being a great ideal. It was brought into life by the present global situation. So that's where I think it's things like that we should be looking for hope.
No, absolutely. I think also we should revive. I think Karl Polanyi made a very useful distinction at some point between individual freedom and social freedom. And of course, individual freedom is the kind of freedom that you were talking about, and it's rather common in the neoliberal framework. You know, it's all about individual autonomy, and it's all about perception of individual choice. Whatever comes to individuals and is perceived as a gain in the short term. But there are other forms of freedom, namely social freedom, whereby things that may not appear to be in the individual's own interest actually contribute to create a better social environment that then generates freedom. And I think this notion probably should be very much revived and is aligned with the kind of ideas that you were talking about earlier in your critique of neoliberalism. Joseph Bosco, let me just start opening the chat box because questions are piling up, really. Joseph Bosco is intrigued about, you mentioned at some point a big lie. I think you were talking about the Anthropocene. And he wanted you to expand a little bit on that. What do you mean by the big lie?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Joe, for that question. I understand that it might sound as if I was using a Trump phrase, and of course I was, borrowing it ironically. But to me, there is a big lie which is perpetrated precisely by the conspiracy theorists, and it comes back actually to what Gonçalo was you were talking about just now about individual versus social freedom. I actually don't like that terminology. I think I would rather see even individual freedom as a social issue, and it's the way that you understand freedom that has to be discussed. That's why it's a social, even individual freedom is part of a social contract. The libertarians are ignoring all of that, and that allows them to live in a fantasy world, and this is where the big lie comes in which we basically ignore the dangers that are being brought about by the ruthless exploitation of the planet, of its animal species, and of its subaltern humans, and the creation of subaltern classes of people, animals, and plants, right? So the creation of this hierarchy is made to look like a reality. And to me, that is the biggest lie of all. It's not a reality, except in the sense that it is, as linguistic philosophers would put it, a performative utterance. It's been brought into existence by being talked into existence. And to me, this is extremely dangerous. It's going on all the time. We have to talk back. We have a voice with which we can talk back.
We have another question to change the topic to the United Nations from someone who does not write his or her name. I will read the question. It seems you are elaborating a tendency to promote a form of societal security in the service of neoliberalism, enforced through borders and surveillance, on top of conventional forms of state security, which could be counterposed to human security, universal dignity. Do you think the debates in the United Nations system over ideas of human security have been helpful in changing the discourse, or have they rather become empty ideas, obscenes, that help prop up the neoliberal order? This is a great question.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Thank you. And the reason it's wonderful is it opens up precisely what is wrong with claims to represent a global order. These are not global orders. If you look at the United Nations, it is still a heavily Western-dominated institution. It's true that some other countries like China are trying to overcome that, but doing it in a way that is also recognizably Western a lot of the time in its derivation. Even looking at something smaller like UNESCO, you see immediately what the problem is. I deal with heritage studies a lot, as Gonçalo mentioned, and the answer to that is that UNESCO is itself the reproduction of that global hierarchy of value to a very large extent. Yes, a number of countries have objected to some of its provisions, but even the distinction between material and immaterial, or intangible and intangible heritage, is a Cartesian invention that doesn't stand up very well to a materialist theory of language, for example. So the question is a great one, because it does seem to me that we live in a world where people very easily say, well, the United Nations is now endorsing this, so it must be okay. The United Nations is nothing more than an agglomeration of nation states. Those nation states all insist on the sanctity of borders. My view is that we need to work with those nation states. I don't wish to remove governance. I'm not in that sense an anarchist, but we need to work with the nation states to try to persuade them that borders of this kind are not a good thing at all. I don't know if it's possible, but I think that it has to start at the United Nations. It has to start with a much more radical critique of the whole notion of securitization, and especially of the way in which it's been applied in countries ranging from the United States in regard to Mexico, to Thailand in regard to Malaysia and Cambodia and Myanmar, to Greece and Italy and Portugal in relation, and Malta and Cyprus as well in relation to North Africa and the Middle East, and so on. I mean, it's the same pattern is occurring everywhere. As migration specialists have pointed out, the migrants are making it through anyway, and so the only result of all of these measures is to create much more human suffering and to inflame local resentments, where instead the initial reaction was often one of generous hospitality.
Questions are piling up. As I said earlier, Michael, Pedro Souza has a question, comment. I will read it. If there's no potential to reach elites or use expertise to improve these pointed social conditions worldwide, can we truly see the rising of social violence and chaos, or instead the surveillance biopolitical system predicting through its instruments would just ghettoize these people even more and control and manage all potential strife, leading to even more dystopian hierarchies? Naturally, also manipulation in media would be great tools on their disposal, managing consent and public opinion. You want to respond to this?
Well, it's a very important question. Yeah, no, it's a very important question. I mean, I think that what it actually speaks to is a fundamental problem that we must face, which is that as a group of so-called marginal people rise up in rebellion of any sort, this is taken by the elite to say, look, you see, we told you so, these people are dangerous, let's crush them. And especially to bourgeois people who represent a class that has just made it and is very worried about losing what it's just achieved, this is a very potent appeal. So rising up in revolution is certainly not going to be the answer, because it's going to get us into even more trouble. That is why we have to work harder also to maintain the respectability and the dignity of the academic profession. It used to be that when academics talked about these things, the world listened. Now, increasingly, we're dealing with a lot of authoritarian voices that dismiss what we say and treat expertise as something inappropriate. Look, I was recently asked to write an article about the pandemic, and I said, I'm not an expert on this. I shouldn't be writing about it. The only thing I could write about is the fact that I'm not an expert. Unfortunately, I trapped myself because the editor said, oh, well, that would be wonderful if you could write about that. So I wrote an article about why I'm not an expert. And in a way, I addressed precisely that question. We have to find a way to get other people to respect the views of those who do know what they're talking about. Now, of course, you would say, well, how are you so sure you know what you're talking about? Maybe the others have it right. Of course, I'm more willing to believe in a credentialed scientist than I am in some politician who simply said, well, the scientists keep changing their minds, so therefore it can't be right. Actually, from an anthropological point of view, and anthropology is, I think, the social science par excellence that has practiced reflexive self-critique. From an anthropological point of view, the fact that somebody admits to a certain uncertainty or admits that now he or she has had to change the evaluation of the situation, to me is like my doctor saying to me, I'm afraid I made a mistake and we have to change your medication. That to me is a sign of a good doctor, not a bad one. He's continuing to take an interest, he's monitoring the situation, he realizes that the dose was incorrect or something. In a larger sense, we as anthropologists, we unleashed this terrible notion of a nation state-like culture on the world. And now everybody talks about cultures as if they were bounded entities that look just like nation states. We now know they aren't, and we have to admit that. And by admitting it, we have also to say, but the fact that we were wrong in the past doesn't mean that you shouldn't be listening to us. We did the best we could with the knowledge we had. That's what we have to do now. That's why also coming back, Gonçalo, to your first question, I don't think there's a final answer to any of this. But the degree of reflexivity practiced by anthropology is the beginning of a cure. That I do believe.
I see. Duncan has a very interesting question as well about your Anthropocene, which is already circulating. So are you using the notion of Anthropocene in the same way as Swingdoe and Ernston do to indicate the depoliticization of the concept in pushing things off stage? Pushing things off stage. Would you comment on this?
I'm not familiar with that work, but I have to say that yes, it sounds it's like something I should read and would find myself in agreement with, because it's precisely the way in which all these terms, Anthropocene, the idea of being liberal, you know, which has to do with a social contract, right? Now the neoliberals have taken it over and turned it into something completely different. I could perhaps suggest that in the United States, the Republicans are not talking about republic anymore. They're talking about, I don't know, I'd rather not say. But here we are. I mean, every term we use can be misunderstood. The word anthropos itself, it's worth recalling, and I am a Greek specialist, among other things, and a speaker of Greek. Anthropos in classical Greek was taken by the European Renaissance as a symbol of our common humanity and used to universalize what in fact were very parochial European concepts. And this is very important to grasp. This is the notion of rationality, for example, as we mostly practice it. It was a very European concept. Now, in modern Greek, and I think using modern Greek to get at the way in which ancient Greek words have been used in English is actually a very subversive, a usefully subversive move. And this is what I like to do. So anthropos in modern Greek means the kind of guy who knows how to fix things and get by in the real world, and also who is fallible. So when somebody wants to admit that he made a mistake, he'll say, anthropy must do, we are human. This is, you know, absolutely, and I've been writing about this for most of my career. Let's use that much more intimate, familiar sense of the anthropos to ask what a good Anthropocene, what a good conception of the Anthropocene could be, how it could be made less BS, less obscene. So thank you for that question, and I think it does speak precisely to what I think of now as the slippery danger of etymological certainties.
We have another question from Pedro Souza. It's a long one. I'm going to read it. With the fall of left rhetoric and critique, were more and more underprivileged classes of either declining middle class, denationalized and delocalized working class, or just pure lumpen proletariat, of either unemployed or homeless and unclassed, don't see themselves inside moderate left-wing organizations and solutions, will political struggle be driven towards more and more towards populism or grassroots movements from bottom up, I suppose, that can be potentially more radicalized? With the fall of centrist parties of either left or right to radical centralism in the likes of neoliberalism, I see more and more the cynical attitude of people leading them towards direct action to do demagogues or movements than anything of face towards the current system. A bit confusing, but there's a question. Thus, what type of political world will we see in the future? This especially with increasing retreat of public state responsibility and growth of power in private mega corporations in all spheres of our lives. Will we be led to anarcho-tyrannic capitalist models of governance?
Wow. Well, I mean, I don't want to be that pessimistic, but the danger that this question speaks to is certainly real. The left, I mean, you saw it in those brief slides I showed you from Rome, where the right moved in because the left was holding its nose and saying, well, after all, these people aren't really poor. And besides, they've been voting more and more for the right. Well, why were they voting for the right? Because the left wouldn't help them. So yes, and the left in Europe in particular, but also such as it is in the United States and certainly in many other parts of the world, has, I think, undermined its own legitimacy through not so much the actions it's performed as the inaction that is perhaps has perpetuated. So the question is actually a very important one. I'm not a prophet. I'm not going to say what I think will happen. I am fearful of the future. And I do think that this kind of conversation is one of the ways that we might actually start to generate a different kind of political mobilization, one that is not violent, but speaks truth to power and appeals to whatever is left of the residual consciences of those people who do in fact manage great wealth. There are a number of entrepreneurs who have given a lot of money for good purposes. Most of them nonetheless do it without really thinking about the structures that they are strengthening. Perhaps through the good offices of this foundation, for example, we might be able to convene a conference with anthropologists on one side of the table and people like Bill Gates and George Soros and others on the other, for us to articulate what we feel is important. But to do that, we also have to find a language that does not sound too excessively academic, while at the same time not talking down to these people who are, after all, demonstrably intelligent. So we have to abandon some of our own attitudes of privilege. And that's not easy to do. I speak for myself in saying that. I think we all have a certain comfort with the privileges that we've enjoyed. At the same time, as I watch the universities sliding more and more into this kind of model, now we see in some countries like Hungary, for example, universities are being paired up with private companies friendly to the prime minister. So this is going to be a new form of thought control. We do have to be very alarmed. And so I think the question is important for, first of all, spelling out the real danger, but also allowing us to suggest that there might still just be time to advance an alternative which would involve a discourse. We cannot refuse to talk to the people in power. That's the other mistake. A lot of anthropologists say, well, you know, we can't talk to the people in power because that would compromise our academic purity. The failure to do so is what compromises our academic decency.
Yeah, I also have a question on that last point, because, you know, some of the speakers in the series so far have expressed some skepticism towards any kind of top-down solutions involving, you know, conversing, you know, engaging in a conversation with powerful institutions and people in power, and so on and so forth. So I'm thinking, for example, about Tim Ingold in the opening session of this series. He seemed to be a little bit skeptical about any kind of top-down solutions, emphasizing instead that, you know, if there's any change, it has to come from the bottom up, from the people. The best way to address the multiple crises associated with the Anthropocene has to do with devolving power to the people. I mean, you seem to have a slightly different view of that. You also emphasize multiplicity of solutions, but you're not so skeptical about the top-down approach as well. I mean, you need to have some kind of top-down configuration and conversations going on as well.
Well, I mean, you know, in a sense, I do agree with Tim, whose work I greatly respect. You know, it's clear to me that we're not going to get anywhere if we keep thinking about the top and the bottom as two essentially different things. We are better placed than any other discipline to get those people who have power, if we can get close to them, to see that they have something in common with the people, their governments, and other forces have marginalized. Just to give you one example, when the Pamahatan community was given a partial reprieve because the then governor of Bangkok had the revolutionary idea of allowing them to stay on the site and become responsible for its maintenance. I voiced the thought that the only way to reform the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration was to insist that every bureaucrat spend at least 3 months as part of his or her training living in a slum community. Because then it's not so much that they would see how much people were suffering, they would realize that those people were also intelligent, proactive, and often extremely wily human beings. They knew it intuitively because the community managed to resist eviction for 25 years. That's an amazing achievement by any standards. They hid it under the legalistic line that the community was now a community of squatters and therefore could legitimately be expelled. And if I had had my way, and if that one governor had stayed in power, because I know him personally and he's a decent man, and I think he really meant to try to make it happen, we could have created an example that was collaboration between the architects who were working with the community, who are academics like you and me, the anthropologists, and there were several who knew something about the community, the members of the community, most of whom, especially their leadership, had demonstrated refined intelligence of a rare order, and the authorities, both the city and the state authorities. And it would have been a model to export to the rest of the world, and the opportunity was blown away. To that extent, therefore, I agree with Tim that it has to start from successful cases done in that way, what we failed to do. And there aren't very many stories of such success. But I certainly would disagree with anyone who said, don't try to talk to those in power, because they have power. And if they cannot be persuaded that it's in their own interests, we're going to have bloody confrontations rather than what I think we would all prefer, which is a swift turn to a more just world.
Yes. I'm going to read a comment from Maria. When you mentioned the increasing security of a few terrorized and the reproduction of colonialism on a global scale, I was reminded of what is going on at the moment in Colombia, specifically the attacks to the Minga Indígena, with colonialism and racism very explicit, and with a dispute over the notion of community, citizenship, and who has the right to speak from those positions. Also, a question from an anonymous. You spoke about the role of education. How do you see decolonizing knowledge, particularly in the global south? How can we challenge the hegemonic position of global powers?
Let me take the second question first. In a way, the first question was more of a comment, I think, and I think a very good one, and I basically agree with it. So let me take the second question as a question, and I would simply say this, that the fact that education is going to be managed by a local, that is a national or subnational authority, does not necessarily mean that it's been decolonized. And of course, the Colombian example, by the way, does illustrate that very nicely. But you find this all over the world, and you find it also in these crypto-colonial states. I mean, as I mentioned, Greece or Thailand. Greece today is actually, to a very large extent, I think, has put all of that behind it. But if you look at what's happening in Thailand in the south, there's clearly a relationship of dominance over the south by the center, which reproduces very old histories in which Thailand was essentially imitating the Western model of domination. You know, if you're going to talk about education, yes, there are a number of initiatives around the world. There's one that's now being put forward by the International Institute for Asian Studies, which I advise in Leiden, as you mentioned, Gonçalo, which is trying to produce a new kind of curriculum in which the practical knowledge of ordinary people is actually made into a form of richness. And this is a real project. Now, it cannot be done effectively without the participation of old-style academics and administrators, because they have to be brought into the design in order to adjust their own ideas and behaviors. So, again, I'm asking for more conversation rather than less. I'm asking for less confrontation of a purely negative, cancelling variety, and more conversations that will also not throw out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, whatever else we can say about neoliberal entrepreneurs, they also have a great deal of experience that can be useful. It's just misdirected.
Michael, one last and very intriguing question, and I would ask you to respond to that as briefly as you can. From Weigan, can we achieve social equality peacefully by, for instance, advocating for diversity and inclusion in representation, getting a seat at the table, etc., without questioning the validity of the table itself? It seems to me that it's the table that might be the real issue. How might we address this?
Beautiful question, beautiful question. And the answer has to be that our skepticism, not cynicism, but our skepticism should lead us, our critical faculty, if you will, should lead us to ask who built the table, what it was built for, and whether it would be suitable for some different direction, and also whether those who own the copyright, the intellectual property of that over that table, are willing to share that property with us. If the answer is yes, I think we can go forward. And there are examples where governments, for example, have done this. Now, I believe in some ways in a strong state. It doesn't have to be a nation state, but I believe in the idea of a strong administration. To me, a strong administration is one that is capable of accepting criticism and engaging with that criticism in a respectful way. And some states do this better than others. Clearly some that did it well are not doing it so well anymore, and there are all sorts of reasons for this. So we are operating in a real world, but I see the ideal picture that the question, in a sense, asks me to construct, and I'd say that ideal picture is a great goal, and one that actually puts into a more concrete form precisely the point of my talk today.
Many thanks, Michael, for your wonderful contribution to the Pluralizing the Anthropocene series. It was truly inspiring talk, and also the discussion was great. Thank you again. Michael has added another layer of pluralization to this series, asking important questions about the notion of planetary security and how it can be deliberately misconstrued for a purpose other than the security of everyone and everything. Anthropology is in a privileged position to adopt a critical stance towards the very idea of the Anthropocene and how its significance might be twisted to serve only the interests of the powerful and the wealthy. Please join me in thanking Michael Herzfeld once again for his contribution to the series, a wonderful way, I would say, to concluding the first season of Pluralizing the Anthropocene. Before you all go, I would like to share with you some exciting news. Pluralizing the Anthropocene will have a second season starting from September 2021. We are very excited about this new development and will soon announce the final program of the second season. Please check the Serralves website for more details as well as for the videos on all the sessions of the first season. Thank you again for your support. See you after the summer. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.